The United States put forward a resolution before the United Nations today, sort of somewhat pretending to call for a ceasefire. It was a major shift from the Biden administration, though it's far short of what people are demanding. To analyze this, we're joined by Trita Parsi, who is the executive vice president over at the Quincy Institute. This morning, he published a piece over at the Responsible Statecraft. I'm going to put this up on the screen here, titled Why U.S. Ceasefire Proposal Failed at UNSC. So go check that piece out over at Responsible Statecraft. Before we get to Dr. Parsi's analysis, let me play a little bit of Dr. Teresa Greenfield. This is the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, who's kind of lambasting China and Russia for vetoing this resolution.
After consulting with all council members and after multiple rounds of edits, the vast majority of this council voted in favor of this resolution. But unfortunately, Russia and China decided to exercise its veto. And now Russia and China will give you all sorts of explanations for its obstruction. But whether or not it will admit it, there are two deeply, deeply cynical reasons behind its votes. First, Russia and China still could not bring itself to condemn Hamas's terrorist attacks on October 7th. Can we just pause on that for a moment? Russia and China refuses to condemn Hamas for burning people alive, for gunning down innocent civilians at a concert, for raping women and girls, for taking hundreds of people hostage. This was the deadliest single attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And a permanent member of this council can't even condemn it. I'm sorry, it's really outrageous, and it's below the dignity of this body. The second reason behind this veto is not just cynical, it's also petty. Russia and China simply did not want to vote for a resolution that was penned by the United States because it would rather see us fail than to see this council succeed. Even after inclusive consultations over weeks and weeks, even after negotiations, an overwhelming council.
Okay, so Trita, what did the resolution after all of these drafts literally call for?
So the operative clause in this resolution is an unnecessarily complicated and convoluted one, which I think has characterized the manner in which the Biden administration has been approaching Gaza from day one. It does not call directly for or demand a ceasefire. It says that a ceasefire is imperative, and then it calls on supporting the process that the U.S. is leading for a ceasefire. And that process is one that the U.S. or the Biden administration has tried to make sure is following parameters that are acceptable to Israel. So it's not a ceasefire per se, it's the American effort for its desired version of ceasefire that this resolution calls for. Moreover, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, the language says that Security Council, quote, determines the imperative of an immediate and sustained ceasefire. So what does that language mean, determines the imperative?
So the strongest term that they could use there is to demand an immediate ceasefire. You have plenty of demands in the resolution itself, but not for this one critical operative clause. Instead, it is a weaker version. It is not as weak as it used to be. An earlier American draft from December said that the ceasefire should happen as soon as practicable, which is a unique and unprecedented way of demanding it. It's a new depth in how weak, yeah, exactly, a new depth in when it comes to using weak language. So in some ways, it's definitely shifting the U.S.'s position. Biden has moved on this. It hasn't moved far enough, clearly. And I think one thing that is really important here, 2 points that I would make. First of all, the Algerians voting against this in some ways is actually more important than the Russians and the Chinese doing so. Of course, the Russians and the Chinese have a veto, so their negative vote kills the resolution. But as I think the U.S. ambassador did point out, there was a bit of pettiness on the Russian side when it comes to this. It's not just because of the substance of this issue. The Algerian ambassador pointed out that he speaks not just for Algeria, but for the broader Arab world. and points out that this resolution does not call for an immediate ceasefire because of a weakening of language when it comes to Rafah. And the earlier version actually demanded that there should not be an incursion into Rafah, any attack on Rafah. This has now been changed. It's been moved to the preamble of the resolution rather than its operative clause. And this is also something that others ambassadors pointed out. This is not putting a strong red line in front of what everyone recognizes would be the most humanitarian disastrous move by the Israelis. And in that sense, interpreted that as a potential green light for the Israelis to go forward.
And the new resolution, as you point out in your piece, expresses, quote, concern that a ground offensive into Rafah would result in further harm to civilians, which that's nice of them to express concern, but as you say, that's quite different than an earlier version, which had demanded an invasion not happen. How did it come to pass that the ceasefire language got slightly tightened by the Biden administration, while at the same time the language that would actually matter around the invasion of Rafah got weakened? What's your sense of internally why the United States moved that way?
I'm not entirely clear, but I'll say one thing, though. What we've seen from the Biden administration's approach to these issues is that it wants the Security Council to be a step behind the American co-led process of negotiations. So, for instance, earlier efforts to veto resolutions was very much because the U.S. didn't believe that the negotiations were at the point where they wanted them to be, and they didn't want the Security Council to put pressure on the Israelis to move in the direction of an agreement to a ceasefire. The U.S. wants the Security Council to follow what the U.S. has already managed to achieve or not achieve. So as a result of that, I think these changes may reflect essentially that the U.S. is now more confident in terms of where it can land on a ceasefire, given the latest round of diplomacy that is taking place, but not so much when it comes to Rafah. And as a result, that may explain this. But I think there's another thing that is really critical here in what the U.S. ambassador said. She issued a clear warning in her comments to the Russian position, in which she said that if another resolution is put forward that does not endorse the diplomacy on the ground, then that will ensure that the Council remains deadlocked, meaning the U.S. will veto it. So essentially saying, if the Russians put forward a resolution that calls for an immediate ceasefire, but it is not tied to the diplomacy on the ground, meaning the one that the U.S. is leading, the one that the U.S. is ensuring is fitting with what the Israelis want, then the U.S. will veto it. And I think this is the crux of the matter. This was not a resolution about a ceasefire. This was a resolution essentially trying to endorse what the Biden administration is doing on the ground in terms of its so far completely unsuccessful and ineffective diplomacy.
Well, unsuccessful if we believe that they're trying to bring an end to the conflict. But it seems it puts the U.S. in a tricky diplomatic position internationally because they have, Russia and China accused the U.S. of kind of deliberately misleading the international community by saying that this was an immediate ceasefire resolution, but then that you look at the actual text of it and it's much watered down. But by kind of misleading the world that the U.S. now supports an immediate ceasefire, it does seem that if Russia or China or somebody else puts forward an immediate ceasefire resolution, it does put the United States in a tricky spot, notwithstanding Linda Thomas Greenfield, preemptively saying that they're going to veto that. When they veto that, it will create this dissonance, won't it, between the public perception that the U.S. just said it was for a ceasefire and then the public action a couple days from now that we'll probably see of the U.S. vetoing an immediate ceasefire resolution.
Whatever the U.S. is gaining in terms of perception, with the Russians and the Chinese now standing in the way of this resolution and any effort to try to shift the blame onto them, will be lost the minute there is another resolution that is actually much more clear on this matter. And particularly if it is also clear on the condemnation of Hamas. I don't think the ambassador was correct in her point there, because the Russians and the Chinese did vote in favor of the Brazilian resolution, which was the first one that was put forward. That condemned Hamas twice in the text. and they voted in favor of that. So I don't think that talking point is going to have a lot of legs. And again, particularly if the next resolution is introduced, it's clear in terms of a demand for immediate ceasefire. This connects to ceasefire from the hostage release. That's the other thing that is very clear in this text, in which it says that all hostages need to be released, but it's connected to the ceasefire. I think the ambassador from Guyana gave quite a fantastic statement there, pointing out that both of these things are unconditional. There should be an unconditional release of the hostages, and there should be an unconditional ceasefire. They should not be connected to each other, because if you do, and as I point out in my text, you're essentially taking 2.1 or 3 million Gazans, civilians, as hostages as well. And that would be equally unfair. So again, your point is quite fair. If it comes to another resolution, whatever short-lived benefit and political points that can be scored with Washington pointing out that the Russians have now put in a veto will be lost a week or two from now.
Last questions. Setting aside the weakness and the hypocrisy of the resolution, what does it say that the administration did shift in this direction and feels like it needs to do this sort of global PR campaign at this moment?
I think that's where you're going to see the greatest political mileage that the administration is going to try to get out of this. You're going to hear a lot in the American context, in which the argument will be Biden put forward a ceasefire resolution, the Russians vetoed it, and use that for domestic political purposes here to make sure that the momentum and the pressure that has been steadily growing, pressing the administration to get serious about a ceasefire, will be dampened because of this talking. So that's where I think the biggest benefit the administration is looking for is coming. It's not what's actually happening in Gaza.
All right. Well, Trita, thank you so much for joining us. As always, really appreciate it. Again, that was Dr. Trita Parsi, co-founder and executive vice president over at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thanks so much, everybody, and we'll see you soon.